Okay, so we're going to do a new type of factoring called factoring by grouping, okay? And this is going to be how you factor trinomials, right? And this is a trinomial because it has 3 terms. 1, 2, 3, okay? And we're going to call this the first term, the last term, and this is the middle term, okay? Now, when we do this, it's actually going to be the opposite of multiplication, right? So in the past, we end up multiplying these things out, and we end up actually with 4 pieces that we combine like terms so that it turns into a trinomial. And in order to factor this, I actually need to go back to the form where we had 4 pieces instead of the 3 pieces we currently see. So what we're going to do, and our first step is always going to be, we have to think about what the pieces are so that we could factor to figure out what we're multiplying and what we want to add to. So our first step is going to be to find something called the product, okay? And our product here is what we find when we multiply our first and our last term. So I do 2x squared times negative 3, and I get negative 6x squared as my product, okay? And now, this is because I want 2 factors that are going to multiply to negative 6x squared, but that are going to sum to my middle terms, because I want to take my middle term and break it into its 2 original pieces, okay? So I need something that's going to sum to this second middle term, which is negative 5x, okay? So now I need to think to myself, what types of numbers are going to multiply to get negative 6x squared? I could do negative 3x and 2x. I could do negative 6x and 1x. And I need one term to be negative because I need to end up with a negative product, right? So they can't both be negative or both be positive because I won't get that then. So what I do next is I think, what would the sum of these be? So negative 3x plus 2x would be negative 1x. So it can't be that because that's not what I want. And then I do negative 6x plus 1x, and I find that that's negative 5x. This is exactly what I want my sum to be. So these are my 2 factors, okay? This negative 6x and 1x, these are going to be what I call my middle terms, because I'm going to replace my original middle terms with my 2 new middle terms. What I mean by that is when I rewrite this, it becomes 2x squared, that hasn't changed, and now I'm going to take negative 5x and I'm going to turn it into minus 6x plus 1x minus 3. I haven't actually changed anything about what this means, because if I were to combine these 2 terms, I would still get that negative 5x. So my expression hasn't actually changed at all, okay? So from here, I'm going to start my process of factoring by grouping. What I mean by that is we're going to group our problem into 2 sections. We have our first group, and then we have the second group. And each group is going to have its own greatest common factor, okay? For example, if I look here, my greatest common factor is going to be 2x, because both of them are divisible by 2x. And if I look in this example, my GCF is going to be, since 1x has nothing in common with negative 3, we're just going to say that our GCF is 1, okay? Because I can't take anything else out of that expression that matches. So from here, I take my GCF, 2x, and I leave in parentheses what's left over when I divide that out. So I do 2x squared divided by 2x, and I'm left with x. and I do negative 6x divided by 2x, and we're left with negative 3 because our x's will cancel, okay? And then I do the same for the other side, and I write plus 1, that's my GCF, and it's a positive number, so I leave it there, and I divide out. And I see that 1x divided by 1 will just be x, and negative 3 divided by 1 will be negative 3. At this point, I can check if I'm doing this right, because I should find that my two parentheses match. I have x minus 3 and x minus 3 here, so they do match, and I've done this correctly, right? So what I do then is, since these are in common, I know my first factor is x minus 3, and I just move it over here. My second factor is going to be made up of my two greatest common factors. So I take 2x plus 1, and I put it together to make my second set of parentheses. This is now the factored form of my original trinomial. And what I can do to check this is I can move it over and do distribution, right? So we do x minus 3 times 2x plus 1, x times 2x plus 1 minus 3 times 2x plus 1. And when I go across and distribute twice, we get 2x squared plus 1x minus 6x minus 3, which is 2x squared minus 5x minus 3. So it checks out, okay? So this is going to be the process of factoring by grouping, okay? And we can do one more example so that we know that this is going to work out every single time, okay? So example 2. We're going to do x squared plus, actually no, we're going to do x squared minus 7x plus 10. Okay. Now, I go through the same process. My first step is to find my product here. So I take my first and my last term, and we multiply it to get 10x to the second power, okay? And then we find our sum, which is just our middle term, and it's negative 7x. So I'm thinking, what things can I multiply to get 10? Well, I can do 10x and 1x, but when I sum those, 10x plus 1x is 11x, and that's wrong. I can do 5x and 2x. 5x plus 2x is 7x. Now, this is right, but my sign is wrong. So what I have to do is think, well, then it has to be negative 5x and negative 2x. Because when I multiply two negatives, I still get a positive 10. But now when I add negative 5x plus negative 2x, I get negative 7x. And this is right. So these are my middle terms. So now I go back and I rewrite it as x squared minus 5x minus 2x plus 10. And I go into the same process of my two groups. I split them up, and I find my greatest common factor. Now my greatest common factor for my first piece is going to be x, because that's all they have in common. And my greatest common factor for my second piece is going to be negative 2, because that's the number, the sign that I see here, and I want to make sure that these two signs are going to match. So this is going to have to be a negative 2. And if you ever end up with the wrong sign, you just know that you pulled out the wrong greatest common factor sign, okay? So here we put x, and we're left with x minus 5, and I rewrite negative 2, and I'm left with x minus 5, because -2 times -5 will give us that +10. So now I have my check done because I see x minus 5 and x minus 5. I know I did this right. So my last step is to rewrite it as x minus 5 times my other set of parentheses is the two outside numbers, x minus 2. And this is my answer. And I can check on the side here and do x minus 5 times x minus 2, and we find x squared minus 5x minus 2x plus 10 is x squared minus 7x plus 10. And that checks out to be our original number. So this is how we're going to do factor by grouping. I want you to try a couple examples by yourself, and if it still does not make sense, we're going to learn it tomorrow, okay? But if you do, awesome.